Facebook does not want to go live, so I'm sorry, everyone. This is going to be one more second. We're trying to go live on Facebook and Zoom to include everybody. Hopefully this is going to go live. Okay, thank you so much for coming to our first event for the Marcus Orr Center for the Humanities. I'm Melanie Conroy, the interim director of the Marcus Orr Center for the Humanities. And tonight's event is called Dante and American Popular Culture. And we have Elizabeth Coggeshall from Florida State University and Dennis Looney from the Modern Language Association in conversation with Cosetta Godenzi. The format for tonight is going to be 2 short talks around 25 minutes, and then there will be plenty of time for discussion afterwards. You can see our 2 upcoming events on March 11th. We have the History Department lecture, This Dastardly Act, San Francisco's 1916 Preparedness Day bombing, and then another event, Memphis-style rap in Germany, with the German rapper Skinny Finista on Wednesday, March 24th. So those are our 2 upcoming events, and we hope you'll mark them in the calendar. They're also on our website if you want to make a note of that, or else RSVP. So thank you again for coming. I am going to ask Cosetta Godenzi from the University of Memphis World Languages, the Italian section, to give us an introduction, both of the topic, why this is such an important year for Dante and Dante studies, and also of our speakers.
Exactly. Okay. Well, welcome to everybody. I'm Cosetta Gaudenzi. I'm very pleased and honored to be able to introduce 2 great Dantisti, Elizabeth Coggeshall and Dennis Looney. This, as Melanie Conroy said, is a special year for Dante. In fact, 2021 is the 700th anniversary of Dante's death. Dante died in 1321. And there are many celebrations that are taking place, not only at the University of Memphis, but also in Italy and also in the world at large. There is one particular event that I would like to mention, and is taking place in Italy near the town where Dante died, Ravenna, in Forlì, which is this wonderful exhibit with the support of the Galleria degli Uffizi in Florence, happening from mid-March to the beginning of July, and it's about representations, drawings, and paintings inspired by the Divine Comedy. So I am really happy to be able to introduce, first of all, Dennis Looney. Dennis Looney is the director of the Office of Programs and director of Association of Departments of Foreign Languages at the Modern Language Association. From 1986 to 2013, he taught Italian at the University of Pittsburgh. And his publications include Compromising the Classics, Romance Epic Narrative in the Italian Renaissance, and Freedom Readers, the African-American Reception of Dante Alighieri and the Divine Comedy. With Dr. Posata, he's also co-editor and translator of Ludovico Ariosto's Latin poetry. So many great books. So please, Dennis, now I leave it to you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen. And as I do that, I want to thank everybody for being here and thank the hosts, Melanie and Cosetta, and University of Memphis. As you'll see in just a second, I know a fair amount about Tennessee. I'll just go ahead and come out. I was born in Springfield, Tennessee, a small town north of Nashville, and I grew up in Nashville. So it's part of my world. I'm going to talk about this project that, oh no, my slide is not moving now. That's interesting. Let me see if I can. I'm going to reshare and make sure. I had a plan B, so here comes the plan B. Okay. This book that Cosetta was kind enough to mention took me into the African-American reception of Dante. And I realized it actually starts in Memphis. And so I thought, how can I not, being from Tennessee myself, talking to the University of Memphis, not sort of dwell on Memphis and Cincinnati and then Nashville, three steps on the way to Dante's entrance into popular American culture. Throughout the 19th century, there was a very animated discussion of contemporary Italian politics and Italian cultural figures, Dante first among them, that was carried out in the popular press in the US and in England. The first published American translation of a passage from Dante's poem appeared in 1791 in the New York Magazine, with the translator William Dunlap tackling a section from the Ugolino episode in Inferno, Canto 33. Dunlap was an active figure on the New York cultural scene. He was, he published, he partied, he lived large, and his interest in Dante, he wasn't a scholar, that's the point I want to make. His interest in Dante indicates the extent to which the reception of the poet developed in popular culture alongside his reception among academics and literary scholars. Americans would respond to Dante over the next 2 centuries and up to today in many different ways. We could call one kind of way academic literary, another way popular. None is more unusual than the response that is guided by the English author Frances Trollope on the left. She's mother of a more famous Trollope, Anthony Trollope, and she's famous for a book that she published in 1832, Domestic Manners of the Americans. In the opening chapter of this book, Trollope alludes to Dante's Inferno to describe what she saw when she arrived in the United States at the mouth of the Mississippi River outside of New Orleans on Christmas Day in 1827 after a 7-week voyage from London. I never beheld a scene so utterly desolate as this entrance of the Mississippi. Had Dante seen it, he might have drawn images of another Bolgia from its horrors. One only object rears itself above the eddying waters. This is the mast of a vessel long since wrecked in attempting to cross the bar, and it still stands a dismal witness of the destruction that has been and a boding prophet of that which is to come. Although the greater part of her journey was over and she sailed from England to the US, her literary allusion suggests that she was about to enter upon the most challenging stretch of her trip. The comparison invites the reader to imagine this bleak panorama that she sees at the delta of the Mississippi, and to imagine it as if it were deep in Dante's hell among in his circles, among the pouches in one of the Bolgias, deep down actually in the 8th circle, where the fraudulent sinners are punished. Her description of a wrecked ship also recalls another passage in the Inferno, the first simile, which likens the protagonist of Dante's poem to a shipwrecked sailor who has just barely escaped death. Here is that passage in the translation of Carey, which is a translation that she would have known, Trollope would have known, but let me just say, Trollope knew Dante in Italian very, very well. And as a man with difficult short breath, forespent with toiling, escaped from sea to shore, turns to the perilous wide waste and stands at gaze, even so my spirit that yet failed, struggling with terror, turned to view the straits that none have passed and lived. Trollope depicts herself in an analogous position to Dante's pilgrim, to the character in Dante's poem, as she sails into the Mississippi Delta. Having survived the crossing of the Atlantic, catching sight of the shipwreck gives her pause to consider the destruction that has been for other less fortunate travelers. And like the sailor in Dante's opening simile, she's safe for the time being, but like Dante the pilgrim, she's about to go deeper or embark on a voyage of even greater danger, for which the eerie mast is a kind of boding prophet of that which is to come. She knows Dante's poem well enough to use this allusion at the beginning of her book to suggest that the new world she's about to enter has things in common with an inferno. But undaunted pilgrim herself on a mission, she sails forward into the river channel and she goes up the Mississippi and she goes to Memphis, which you can see on this map. This is a map from 1832. And you can see Memphis and then about 3 inches to the right, well, here I can put it, Neshoba, which is now where Germantown is. Trollope was on her way to a utopian community, a pioneering interracial utopia in the forests of West Tennessee, a bit east of Memphis, dedicated to the gradual emancipation through cooperative working arrangements and dedicated to the education of freed, former enslaved peoples, men and women, children and adults. This community was established in 1825 by one of her friends and acquaintance from England, a very free-spirited and for at the time very well-known abolitionist, Frances Wright. And here you can see Frances Wright with pens on her desk, with a text with a scroll in her hand, a text, something she's written, and you can see her in this pensive mode. Frances Wright was a thinking woman. She gave lectures all around the Northeast, central part of the US and Northeast, and was criticized for that, but didn't hold back. And not only was she an abolitionist, she was also very, very important for the development of a culture of women's rights in upstate New York and other places where Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass and others then came into their own. Neshoba, as I said, is where Germantown is today. You all know these places, I don't. Where there's a city park called Neshoba Park, and there's a road called Neshoba with an E. Trollope and her 3 children arrived to be there with Frances Wright and to help at the school, but they arrived to their great dismay. The colony was undeveloped. There were few settlers. There was no school. There was inadequate housing. There was poor food. And all of this was in a really rough setting with a bad climate, at least in January. Trollope describes Neshoba in much the same language. Here's a drawing of Neshoba that she, without relying precisely on Dante, it sounds like an inferno. The forest, as we went up towards Neshoba, became thicker and more dreary looking every mile we advanced. They had a guide whom she refers to as our ever-grinning Negro. He declared it was a right good road and that we should be sure to get to Neshoba. And so we did. One glance sufficed to convince me that every idea I had formed of this utopia was as far as possible from the truth. Desolation was the only feeling, the only word that presented itself. And in fact, she and her 3 children only stayed 10 days in this place where she had crossed the ocean to come to. Her comment in that description, go back a bit, her comment about the guide that they have leading them from Memphis and the wharfs to Neshoba, her comment about the evergreening Negro, and what I take to be the imitation of her speech, her reference to his speech, her reference to the right good road, suggests that maybe she wasn't as ready for interracial cooperative living as she had imagined. She quickly made plans to leave the utopia, on the grounds that the malarial waters surrounding it endangered the health of her children. Looking back at her very brief stay and thinking about her friendship with Frances Wright, she remembered it positively in this way, emphasizing her friend's commitment to the good work. Quote, her whole heart and soul were occupied by the hope of raising the African to the level of European intellect. And even now that I've seen this fabric of her imagination fall to pieces beneath her feet, I cannot recall the self-devotion with which she gave herself to it without admiration. Wright herself was soon to abandon the project at Neshoba. It was just too hard to try to do what she was trying to do. And let me say, this was a woman, Frances Wright, doing this more or less on her own. Wright abandoned it herself. She went up into the Northeast, as I said, and became an abolitionist, an active abolitionist, and active also for women's rights in the US until she died in 1852. Trollope sailed upriver, up the Ohio to Cincinnati, which was a new boomtown in what people were calling Western America. And she got there on February 10th, 1828. And in fact, it's the population of Cincinnati that became her laboratory for studying Americans that she writes about in Domestic Manners of the Americans, written very much for English readers back home, and peppered with citations, or peppered with citations from Dante. It's a very literary portrait of Americans, part travel guide, part literary essay, part sociological study. It was a gigantic hit in England and went into 5 editions in the 1830s. Trollope, when she got to Cincinnati, had to figure out how to survive. She hadn't been there long before she established a commercial venture tied to a local museum, which she described as Dante's Hell. And here you can see a poster from it. Here it's referred to as Infernal Regions, but in another place, Dante's Hell. The readers of Cincinnati's Saturday Evening Chronicle found this advertisement on the back sheet of the newspaper on August 30th, 1828. And if they were reading deeper, they would see the proprietor of the Western Museum, always anxious to oblige his subscribers and the public and to render his museum as attractive to them as possible, begs to announce that in future, the entrance to the museum will also admit to the splendid scenic exhibition of Dante's Hell, Purgatory and Paradise without additional charge. So here you can see one of the few images that we have of this thing she created. There's a gigantic devil at the center, and there are all kinds of devils around, and it looks like flames over here, and it could be some ice back up in here, maybe some forests here. It's hard to read, with a lot of damned beneath the king devil, as it were. The museum also has a mermaid in it, and it's got some other things that they're excited about. Frances Trollope knew her Dante and knew her Dante well. And once she got to Cincinnati, she knew that Dante would work in that frontier town. She joined forces with the owner of this museum, whose collection included natural historical oddities and lots of Native American artifacts. And she connected with a young artist, a man who would go on to become arguably the most important sculptor of 19th century America, Hiram Powers. And with him, she created this Chamber of Horrors, or this museum. And we can go ahead and just say everything was made out of wax. It's a wax museum. Her oldest son, Thomas, later in life, recalled that collaborative, creative collaboration. And it occurred to her, my mother, to suggest to the artist Hiram Powers to get up a representation of one of Dante's pouches, as described in Dante's Inferno. The sculptor, with his innate imaginative brain, his artistic eye and clever fingers, caught at the idea immediately on the instant, and forthwith they set to work, my mother explaining the poet, suggesting the composition of tableaus, and supplying details, while Powers, the artist, designed and executed the figures and the necessary mise en scène. Actors playing the part of infernal greeters roamed the dark, as frightened visitors made their way from one scene to the next. Powers mechanized much of the exhibit, adding, quote, a metal rod as a barrier between the show and the spectators, and he contrived to charge it with electricity, end quote. So if you touched things, sometimes you got slight shocks. And by the end of 1829, the exhibit had grown, according to the newspaper again, to include upwards of 50 wax figures, size of life, consisting of phantoms, imps, monsters, devils, among which Beelzebub and Lucifer most conspicuous, with a variety of human sufferers in every stage of torment. So here we are in Cincinnati. There's a Dante's Wax Museum. It's very popular, more on that in just a second. And we have a description of somebody who goes to see the museum. The spectacle, we know, was set up in an upstairs attic space at the museum. It was only open at night. It recreated, as her notes suggest, different sections of Dante's Hell, fire and ice sections of Dante's Hell. It also had depictions of purgatory and paradise painted on backdrops at the very back of it. And it was mechanized and animated, and these actors were walking around, including Powers and Trollope herself, scaring people. It quickly became, and here I'm quoting a scholar, the most celebrated single attraction staged by an American museum in the pre-Civil War era, end quote. So a visitor from Boston, Linus Everett, described the exhibit for his Quaker magazine, the Quaker Trumpet, in some detail. And he lavished a lot of attention on hell. So I'm quoting this Quaker Everett in 1829. On the right hand of the devil, one sees this spectacle. And I'm going to go down just to the last sentence. But what added much to the effect was the condition of a poor old Negro just entering upon a state of perpetual freezing, a sad predicament truly for one so constitutionally fond of a warm climate. Everett's description, so this visitor's description of the poor old Negro in Dante's Hell, I assume, is the first connection made in print between Dante's Inferno and African American culture. As I document in my book, Freedom Readers, it's a venerable, long-lasting association extending from this moment on the frontiers of America to contemporary African American culture today. The team of Trollope and Powers sought to give realism to the scene of the damned in their version of Dante's Hell by adding men and women, even to the point of adding a Black man. This is an integrated hell. It may be that they're trying to say, hey, white visitors to our museum, Black Americans or Black enslaved peoples have souls too, in case you didn't know. Statues of Africans occur in 19th century American art, but generally not until somewhat later in the century, not until the abolitionist movement made the plight of enslaved peoples an issue in the 1840s and 50s. And then in the aftermath of the Civil War, when freed slaves adorned sometimes public monuments. Powers' wax figure is probably the earliest association of Dante in African American culture and art. And could this image of a Black man in hell also be the earliest sculpted representation of an African American by a white artist in the United States? I don't know. Alas, nothing remains of the wax figure as far as we know, and for our knowledge of it, we depend completely on this description. The language of this description tells us much about the kind of portrait they created. The verb in that last sentence, added, suggests, but what added much to the effect suggests that this is additional, marginal somehow, in some unspecified way. It's not quite central, but still I want to emphasize that it's there. And I want to emphasize what he says, it's highly effective, what added much to the effect. And Everett himself in the printed magazine italicizes the word effect. The patronizing phrase, poor old Negro, recalling the evergreening Negro previously. Poor old Negro calls to mind that character from stereotypes, the hobbling, obedient, servile, older Black man of a fairly familiar 19th century, 20th century stereotype. But this is an Uncle Ned, as he's sometimes called, who has stepped out of line, who hasn't been obedient, who hasn't been servile, at least not to God. Here's a Black man who forgot who his real master was, God, and pays the price. That he's depicted just entering upon a state of perpetual freezing. And I should have emphasized, reminded you, some souls in hell are burned, some souls in hell are frozen. The deeper you go, the more frozen are the souls, and the worse it is. And so this is a soul who's frozen. He's just entering upon a state of perpetual freezing. It indicates that he's just been condemned to his place in hell. He's going to freeze there forever. He's just arrived. The spectator witnesses the initial shock of the frigid setting on the dead man's soul. And that condescending quip on the fate of this person of color is also revealing. The last sentence, sad predicament indeed for one so constitutionally fond of a warm climate. It's a comment that raises several questions. Is this Black man a free citizen of Cincinnati? There were some. Or is he an enslaved person? Cincinnati was an important stop on the way north to freedom. Out of Kentucky, there's actually a museum to freedom, a museum to abolitionism and freedom in Cincinnati today. It was an important stop on the way north to freedom, and it had already had a sizable Black presence as early as 1829, although those new immigrants were not always welcome. In fact, there was extensive anti-Black rioting in the city in these years around the time, in 1828, 29, and 30, as this museum and exhibit were coming up. Does this comment by the writer, the Quaker, about warm climate refer to somewhere in the South where the Black man had come from, or to his ancestral lands in Africa? And then the last thing I want to comment on in this passage is why the exclamation point? What's the joke? Perhaps there's a pun in the adverb constitutionally, which would have been very much in the spirit of the polished verbal wit practiced by Trollope and her friends. Of course, the poor old Negro was not protected by the US Constitution, a fact that had prompted a growing number of US citizens to think about ways to help the African enslaved Africans with situations, with utopian settlements like Nashoba that had brought Trollope here in the first place. It does sound kind of like a bad joke, racist humor of the sort that there is, alas, a long tradition in the United States. And so one knows not to be surprised. Still, I want to emphasize a quip like this on a wax version of Dante's Inferno reported in a Quaker periodical is unexpected, and it catches one's attention. So I want to summarize Trollope and Cincinnati and take you to Nashville really quickly before I conclude. The Wax Museum in Cincinnati is significant in the history of the reception of Dante for several reasons, I think. The writer, Frances Trollope, uses her interpretation of Dante's text to respond to problems that she had earlier described in terms of that same Dantesque text. On the edges of this new wild world, remember she's English and she's proper, on the edges of this new wild land where she had come seeking utopia, but found instead an infernal landscape, harsh and unforgiving, she created a pseudo-inferno, an ersatz inferno, a commercial kind of inferno, as if to ward off or bottle up the potential evil within that actual landscape that confronted her. Her version of Dante may be the first commercial, non-publishing, commercial enterprise to capitalize so directly on the original, a model that would be imitated many times over in the coming years and coming decades and into the 20th century, with Dante's vision of hell becoming a standard source of inspiration for haunted houses, fun houses, on the midways and carnivals and fairs around the United States. Nashville. This is Centennial Park, and that's the Parthenon in the middle of Centennial Park. That's the first version of the Parthenon, which was built in 1896 and then taken down and were replaced with what you see now if you go to Nashville Centennial Park. That the second final version was finished in 1920. And those are ponds that are still there. And when I was a kid, I fished in those little ponds and many times fed ducks in those ponds. In 1896, in celebration of the centennial of Tennessee, an exposition was organized in Nashville, Centennial Exposition. It ran from the late spring into early fall. The fair, like these expositions did in those days, focused on commerce, industry, agriculture, and also art, with large pavilions, some of which you see, dedicated to these broad themes. There was also a section of fairgrounds called Vanity Fair, a carnival called Vanity Fair, given over to entertainment, but also educational entertainment, one might say. It included the actual cabins where Abraham Lincoln was born and where Jefferson Davis was born. So the notes tell me. It included the recreation of a Colorado gold mine. It included a cinema, Edison's Mirage, which introduced Nashvillians to motion pictures. And it had a simulated old plantation with African Americans working the fields under the watchful eyes of white overseers on big horses. So some things, it's good to be reminded of these moments in our history 30 years after the end of the Civil War, after Reconstruction. Here's Nashville, here's Tennessee, reminding everybody about plantations and who's tending the crops. It also included this, a section called Night and Morning. And if you can see, and you can see it's sort of Arabesque, Moorish, Orientalist looking. It also included a thing called Dante's Inferno, a fun house, a haunted house through which people walked with a guide. And here is what someone said. We walked through. After this, the journey was resumed and the party was taken through a grotto past the infernal regions. Dante's Inferno is illustrated with pictures and scenes, and through the grotto lined with skulls and peopled with uncanny things, the road went on. Then at the darkest and most doleful part of the journey, the end of night was reached, and there was a sudden change. A door opened and a flash of light almost blinded the party at the front in the lead. The haunted house recreated Dante's journey through hell, leading the reader to the last passage in Inferno 34, the very end of Dante's Inferno, where, in imitation of the pilgrim's journey, as he emerged from the darkness of hell to see the light again, to see the stars. We don't have a full description of how this grotto, Dante's Inferno, that I have found yet, a full description of how it was experienced, but similar versions of Dante's Inferno at other fairs at the same time mentioned mirrors, archways, corridors, even rivers, or, quote, the throne room of Satan himself, with all kinds of mechanical effects, etc., as they were built up. Nashville was a southern city. It had some sophistication, thought of itself as a sophisticated city, called itself Athens of the South, but it didn't have an academic tradition of reading Dante as did Boston and New York. So where did this interest in Dante come from? To me, there's no question that it's connected with Cincinnati's Dante's Inferno, created by Trollope and Powers. It's derived from that wax museum, and it represented the permutation of that first popular Dante going deeper into the provinces of the people. I want to end on one more object. In 1935, a film made by Fox called Dante's Inferno, starring Spencer Tracy, and there's a young Spencer Tracy, and debuting Rita Hayworth. Her name in Italian was Canzone, I think, Canzone. Rita Hayworth in a minor role. It's my final example of the widespread popularity of this carnival wax museum haunted house version of Dante. Tracy's character, and here you can see him thinking pensively, enlarges the Dante's Inferno haunted house that he's operating at the fair in the movie. And he does it without concern for visitor safety. He doesn't follow the rules or the guidelines or the codes. And he's challenged by someone who's who's trying to keep him from doing it, and he keeps doing it, and he builds it up, and it's too big, and it all caves in. He wants to make money, and he bribes the inspectors who try to block him from making money. You can see how many people are coming into his carnival show. A 10-minute vision of hell proper, which is actually taken into this movie from a previous silent film, can't deter Spencer Tracy's character's greed, and the film ends in tragedy when the whole thing caves in and burns up. So here's another poster from the movie, Dante's Inferno, and you can see across the top, it will burn itself in your memory forever. The moral of the story, even this popular Dante should be able to teach you about the differences between right and wrong. So Frances Trollope had come to the United States at the behest of her friend Frances Wright to teach freed Blacks at Nashoba. And that utopia that she came seeking was, and the utopia that she came seeking was that of a new world where whites enabled liberated Blacks to make progress and get on with the work of freedom. Nashoba was a failure, as we saw, but I'd love to know more about what they were imagining in their curriculum. I can't find information about that, but it was practically a failure. It was for all practical purposes a failure. But Trollope's failure at that utopian project enabled the development of the other project I've talked about, and I want us to think of it as utopian too. For her establishment of a Dante Wax Museum on the frontier, with its integrated panorama of Black and white centers, is but the first moment in a history of reception that will extend into the 21st century with ramifications for how we've come to understand the notion of freedom outlined in Dante's poem. Indeed, her version of Dante's hell, with that, Trollope may not have turned her back on whatever it was that prompted her to come to the New World in the first place. The Wax Museum, I want to submit, becomes merely a different sort of teaching space, a teaching venue, different from the schoolhouse for slaves, with a different set of students. The Carnival Haunted House and films about the Carnival Haunted House become unexpected schoolrooms for learning what we need to learn to make our union more perfect, better for all of us together. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Great presentation. And now we make a jump to the 20th century, to another great project, Dante Today, Sightings and Sightings of Dante's works in contemporary culture, something that Beth Coggeshall is doing together with Ariel Sabet. Elizabeth Coggeshall is our next speaker, PhD, Stanford University, specializes in the literature and culture of medieval Italy with a particular focus on Dante. Her research centers on the intersections of literature, ethics, and cultural identity, medievalism and popular culture, and the transmedia reception of Dante's works. She's currently completing a book manuscript on the disputes over the role of friendship in medieval Italian literary culture. She's also co-editor of Dante Today. So please, Beth.
All right, so I have shared my screen. I hope that you all can see it. Yes, you can see the, okay, great. Okay, so I want to start by thanking so much Melanie and Cosetta for hosting us. Thank you to the University of Memphis for hosting us. Thanks as well to Dennis for joining me in this conversation. And thank you to all of you. I don't think I've ever given a talk to this many people at once. So thank you to all of you for joining us here today, and for your interest in Dante and in the continued resonance of his works in this anniversary year, 700 years after his death. I was originally scheduled to give this talk in person last spring before national shutdowns and travel advisories made that visit impossible. And so I'm especially grateful to Melanie and Cosetta and their colleagues and their students for pivoting so gracefully and so fluidly to host Dennis's and my talks in this virtual format, such that, you know, so many of my students can be here today, which I'm really grateful for. My parents are here too. So thank you to all of you for joining us. I'm really keen on taking questions and hearing comments about how you see Dante's resonance unfolding in 2021. And I'd really love to know more about what you want to know more about. So please don't be shy, either posting questions in the chat or unmuting yourselves and just asking when we get to the Q&A. So I'm going to start by telling a story, which is a story that I like to tell when I talk about our archive. So in mid-November 2017, Pablo Mauret, who is an Argentinian essayist and writer, and who was then a professor of literature at a small Midwestern college, tweeted to no one in particular. Whoops, let me see if I can get my slides to advance. Oh my. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to restart my slideshow. Give me just a second.
I think the problem of PowerPoint is when you click on the whole slide, it stops. So maybe just keep all the slides on the side and just.
Okay, I'm gonna give this a try. Try it again and share again. Okay. There you go. Okay, so Pablo Mauret tweeted to no one in particular his intention to reread Dante's Divine Comedy, one canto per day, for the first 100 days of the new year. Within a few weeks, that tweet had mobilized a mass of fellow readers across the Spanish-speaking world. So using the hashtag Dante2018, Twitter users posted quotations, comments, links, graffiti, illustrations, and photos, often selfies, as they progressed collectively through the poem. Copies of the Divine Comedy were flying off the shelves in Buenos Aires, while illustrators, designers, and performers generated and circulated works inspired by and responding to their reading. Mauret estimates that several thousand Twitter users from 5 continents participated in the reading, making the Divine Comedy one of 2018's hottest trending topics across Latin America. So the unlikely virality of something like Dante 2018 speaks to the broad and deep global resonance of Dante's 14th century epic poem, even in our 21st century. So the digital archival project, Dante Today, Sightings and Sightings of Dante's Works in Contemporary Culture, seeks to capture and promote the effects of that resonance as Dante's works echo within, across, and against contemporary cultures. I co-direct the project, which has been online since 2006, with Ariel Saber of Bowdoin College, and with the support of IT staff, digital humanities specialists, and students from each of our home institutions. Our work serves 2 distinct ends. On the one hand, we preserve a set of cultural ephemera that, if not collected, would likely pass unnoticed or even disappear. And on the other hand, we bear witness to an otherwise undocumented global conversation among contemporary artists and writers who utilize Dante's works as a lens through which to describe, analyze, and critique the contemporary world. So today I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the Dante Today archive and how it fuels my own research on Dante in contemporary and especially in popular American culture. My talk is going to have 2 parts. So first I'll talk you through the site, its history, and its setup. And then in the second part of my talk, I'll walk you through an example of my own research process on a particular question that emerged out of my interest in the site, which is what I think of as the most viral meme to come out of Dante's Divine Comedy. But more on that in a second. So on the Dante Today archive. For those of you who haven't visited the site, and if you're not already looking at it, I'm going to go ahead and post the URL in the chat so that you can peruse it if you wish. For those of you who haven't visited the site, probably the best way to get to know it is to peruse some of its more than 1,500 artifacts. We have collections of board games, decks of playing cards, liner notes in rock albums, sculptures in bronze, marble, ceramic, porcelain, sand, Lego, marionettes, cinnamon candies, dozens of different hot sauces, computer operating systems and programming languages, an advertisement for sneakers or for cell phone service, a parking garage in Florence, an elementary school in Boston, restaurants and nightclubs in London, New York, Paris, Budapest, Chicago, Seattle, San Francisco, Bogota, Cuzco, and the Cleveland Indians baseball stadium. The Comedia's stamp on modern culture is far-reaching and in many spheres well-documented. There's a growing and critical body of scholarship that testifies to the broad, but not always deep, imprint that the Commedia has left on, especially but not only, American and European literatures, cinema, visual art and architecture, even comic books and graphic novels. And I'll point to Dennis Looney's work on the reception of Dante's works among Black American writers and artists as a model for how to do this kind of research. But Dante's reach extends far beyond what I think of as sanctioned categories of reference, and far fewer studies have investigated Dante's ubiquity across the artifacts of mass culture, in advertisements or in street art, in internet memes or on social media, restaurant menus, place names, album titles, song lyrics, and so on. Dante, and especially his Inferno, are everywhere and trending. So the website aims to serve as a single reference point for all of these engagements, from the most learned forms of high culture to the most superficial forms of mass culture. We've designed Dante Today as a crowdsourced and curated digital repository that catalogs references to Dante and his works in the 20th and 21st centuries. In its current design, the Dante Today site is divided into 7 pages: the homepage, which you see here, the submit a citing form, relevant Dante-related links, bibliography, which is currently under construction, reconstruction, a user's guide, a teaching resources page, and an about page. Each post, of which you see an example here, shows a title, image, a brief quotation or description, a category, and tags, as well as a list of other posts that have been similarly tagged. You can see the closely tagged posts list at the bottom there. All of the information in each post is hyperlinked to other sources, either inside or outside of the site, so that all the images and descriptions can be traced to their original online sources. In the right-hand sidebar, you'll see the list of categories, as well as a random post, the most frequent tags organized into a tag cloud. There's an image of the current, or close to the current tag cloud on the left, as well as a link to the full list of tags, of which you see a glimpse on the right, to our image mosaic of some of the most eye-catching posts, and to the map of sightings. Although all the posts are curated by our research team, they are also very importantly crowdsourced. So we receive submissions through the Submit a Citing tab from students and teachers, both in high schools and in higher ed, as well as artists, writers, performers, curators, marketers, scholars, and lay people from around the world. Once submissions are received, we tag, map, and categorize them. And you can see, again, the categories here. Aside from our general categories and tags, we avoid imposing any sort of classifications onto the references. So because our primary objective is to document the global reception of Dante's works, Saber and I have chosen not to provide any sort of expert commentary on the artifacts in the collection, nor to enable the participation of users through upvoting, liking, or commenting on individual posts. Rather, we think of our work strictly as that of archivists who carefully select the objects to be included in the collection, thoughtfully devise their descriptions, and then step aside to let our audience engage with them how they will, through features like the search box, which is accessible on the homepage, or the tag list, each visitor using his or her own metrics to analyze the ways that these artifacts use Dante's works to comment on contemporary culture. So we've chosen not to classify references according to the depth of their engagement, nor do we assess the fidelity of a particular reference to the original poem. To put it simply, fidelity and depth are not the only measures that matter in the analysis of these data. To give you an example, the Dante's Inferno video game, which is a well-known and much discussed example, that example might engage deeply with the poem, but its accuracy is up for debate with its crusader pilgrim and his damsel in distress Beatrice. Does this matter to the way that we evaluate the game's efficacy or worth in our research questions or in the classroom? It depends on the question that's posed. Contrast this example with the fact that the 5th episode of season 1 of the HBO television series Westworld was titled Contrapasso, which is a term that comes directly out of Dante's Inferno, which many scholars use as shorthand for describing the entire system of infernal justice. The episode makes no other explicit mention of Dante. And so is the video game, for all its depth, any more interesting or relevant to the question of Dante's resonance in contemporary culture than the title of this television episode? Ariel and I both have our thoughts, but we leave the question up to our readers to determine. We do, however, do a great deal of curating for the site, mostly consisting of asking ourselves the question, is this really a reference to Dante and his works? To give another example, one of my favorites, the Simpsons episode Treehouse of Horror 4, which aired in 1993 in the 5th season of The Simpsons. In this episode, Homer bargains his soul for a donut, and when he caves to temptation and eats the donut, a devilish Ned Flanders swoops him off to hell, where he's sent to the Ironic Punishment Division of Hell Labs. That's what it's called, the Ironic Punishment Division. In Dantesque retribution, Homer is then forced by the devil to binge eat thousands of those pink glazed ring donuts that we know he loves, which he does gleefully, much to the devil's surprise. And this is where the curation comes in. There's no direct reference to Dante in the episode, but the very notion of an ironic punishment, a punishment that's meant to reveal something about the nature of the crime itself, comes to American popular culture through the influence of Dante's poem. So the curatorial team that's comprised of Saber and me, along with small teams of undergraduate research assistants from our respective institutions, collaborate to discover, research, and identify clear references to the poet or his works. So I've already talked about how the archive has been set up and how it might be used. Now I'll turn to a demonstration of the kind of analysis that's enabled by the archive's holdings. So I'm going to turn to one of my own research threads on what I like to call Dante memes. And this will be the second part of my talk. So in my research, I'm very invested in making sense of how Dante enters the American popular imaginary, much more so through his Inferno than through his Purgatorio or Paradiso, although we can of course get to that question in the Q&A. I'm really interested, especially in the very trivial, very reductive, very superficial, and sometimes inaccurate ways that Dante enters into our American imaginary. One of the aspects of this superficial, reductive, trivial Dante that I set out to explore in my own research is the array of internet references to the so-called circles of hell. I am sure that Dennis and Cosetta and other longtime Dante aficionados here in the audience have at least, if not a very deep familiarity, a passing familiarity, if not a deep familiarity, with the variations on the circles of hell meme that crop up across the internet, particularly on blogs and shared through social media. But one of the most surprising discoveries in my research was just how ubiquitous this meme really is. And I'm quite certain that I've only just begun to scratch the surface in what is perforce fairly haphazard research. So in my research, I focused on references that are easily disseminated through social media sites, YouTube, Pinterest, Tumblr, blogs, and other digital platforms that make hyperlinked or shareable media readily available to users. Google searches for the term circles of hell, the fixed term circles of hell, lead to any number of takes on the circles meme, some illustrated, some mapped, and some with very detailed descriptions of an appropriate contrapasso, an appropriate punishment for each sin punished therein. Just to name a few, we find the 9 circles of internet hell, the 9 circles of Thanksgiving travel, the 9 circles of marathon training hell, and the 9 or 7, if you ask Governor Cuomo, circles of Penn Station hell. Science, research, libraries, development, PR, writing, and plagiarism all have their own versions of the 9 circles, but the NFL draft only has 5. Beaumont, Texas, Columbus, Ohio, and Malta each have their own 9 hellish circles. The University of Chicago, Columbia University, Knox College, Northwestern, and Pitt all have their own 9 circles of campus hell. Very popular on my social media accounts was PhD Comics' Dante's Inferno Academic Edition from 2015, which was complemented by the 9 circles of adjunct hell, and McSweeney's 10th circle, reserved for tenured professors who find the heads of their graduate students, quote, fully absorbed in their derrieres, end quote. There are 9 circles of the New England winter and 700 of bikini shopping. Email hell has many different versions, as does parenting hell, which is sometimes known as mom hell, Disney hell, girls clothing hell, or youth sports hell. In addition to these specific hells of modern life, numerous bloggers have created modern hells, such as the one created by this like College Humor some years ago. And I just looked for it. It's no longer on the site, so you can only get it here with its 9 circles, such as people who look at their phones while walking down the street, or people who quote internet memes in conversation. There are also updated guides to the Inferno, such as Jesse Riggle and Callie Roy's book, Go to Hells, which includes 71 new sins of modern life. Another common digital meme deriving from Dante's topography is the addition of the so-called 10th circle for the 21st century. I'll start with a personal favorite, which is the Onion's Corp Adverticus, which is reserved for publicists, marketers, lobbyists, awards show hosts, among others. And Dante also provided the title for one of the Onion's many retrospectives, which was called Dispatches from the 10th Circle. Many 10th circles express their impatience with which we experience our digital lives. So we get something like buffering, either for their frustrating slowness, like buffering, or for their Byzantine architectures, like iTunes, or for their failure to provide the reprieve from loneliness that was promised by social media and other digital communication tools. Some of the 10th circles are local places. The DMV is probably a predictable candidate. And in fact, there are many more of these than I could possibly include on a slide. IKEA might be a less predictable candidate, but one might be downright surprised to find the 10th circle located in a place like Claire's, which for those of you who don't know is an accessory store that caters to teen and preteen girls. The parking lot of the Wegmans on East Avenue in Rochester, New York is another candidate for a 10th circle, as are Cinderford, England, a small industrial town in England, and a mall in Lafayette, Louisiana. Institutions also get raked over the infernal coals. Insurance companies, cable companies, Dell customer service, the bureaucracy in Bolivia, school parking lots, yoga sculpt, winter grocery shopping with toddlers, and of course, ladies' shoes. Some of you may have seen another New Yorker cartoon, this one from early 2016, which advertised construction work in hell with a sign reading, "Coming soon, Trump Circle." This is just one of many references to the Inferno during the 2016 presidential campaign, which could be found on both sides of the political aisle. It seems like one of the few points of consensus between political bloggers and journalists on both the left and the right in 2016 was that that campaign season itself was hell. In fact, the suggestion was originally Barack Obama's, using a reference to Dante's Inferno. The precision of Dante's punishments seems to be the most relished aspect of the comedy that's imitated by internet commentators. All of the various editions of these circles in hell point beyond the topography of Dante's hell to the distribution of justice in his schema. It's the moralizing specificity of sins under indictment in the comedy that fuels the imaginations of these commentators. Typically, the references make no mention of Dante's original scheme or even of the poem itself. They simply hijack the idea that punishments in hell are distributed in discrete circles, often called levels, and then they appropriate the schema to their own ends. These ends seem to fall into 2 distinct, albeit related categories. The first group lean on the mechanics of Dante's system to present a passive-aggressive takedown of modern behaviors or attitudes that the producers find distasteful. So to give a telling example of this tendency, we see BuzzFeed Media's 23 circles of hell that should exist for the modern age. Adam Ellis, the author, claiming that the Inferno was written, quote, like a million years ago, decides that, quote, it's about time we dug a few circles deeper, end quote, and adds 14 new circles to Dante's original 9. So Ellis's circles include people who walk too slow on the street, able-bodied people who take the elevator a single floor, and my personal favorite, people who bring 11 items to the 10-item express lane. I don't know if that makes you crazy, but it makes me crazy. The humor of Ellis's post hinges on the moralizing perspective that's appropriated from Dante's schema, which metes out justice for offense in precise one-to-one measure, the punishment exactly fitting the crime. In referencing Dante's name and borrowing his topography, the blogger appropriates the moral weight of the canonical poem, capitalizing on the righteousness of his predecessor to effect a stronger critique. Ellis invites his readers into a tacit complicity in a kind of group character assassination. Each image is equipped with share buttons that readers can use to repost the image on their own social media accounts, each like acknowledging a shared collective dislike. So the spreadability, and this is a word that I borrow from media theorist Henry Jenkins, and it's a term that I'm going to return to later. The spreadability of images like this promotes participation in a collective judgment that's passed by the blogger, his readers, and their friends and followers, all strung together by the image and its sharing mechanism. Like the first group of bloggers, the second group also borrow the topography of the Inferno to enumerate the minor annoyances of middle-class life in 21st century America. But their thrust is not turned outward toward the behavior of others, but rather turned inward, lamenting the difficulties of one's own situation, what internet culture has generally come to refer to as first world problems. So those references tend to provide extensive commentary on the pitfalls of certain lifestyle choices, parenthood, graduate school, social media addiction, and so forth. Authors of various parenting hells, for example, tend to give brief asides that suggest that parenting could or maybe should be nothing other than paradise, aside from the horrors that await those raising children of any age, from toddlers to teens. Blogger Meredith Gordon's post on the 9 circles of hell for moms is one of the rare examples of this trend that make even passing reference to the original poem and its setup. Gordon claims that motherhood has inspired her to brush up on those dreaded classics, works which, she worries, her elementary and middle school age children will soon be bringing home for a classroom reading assignment. She complains that, quote, her mom brain has turned to mush, end quote, and that she can't read the text carefully because, she claims, quote, if I were to actually sit down and reread Shakespeare or Chaucer, I'm fairly certain I'd have no time left for feeding and clothing the kids, end quote. Gordon's self-described Google, Wikipedia, Cliff's Notes approach to reading the classics brings her to the conclusion that the pilgrim's suffering as he travels through the 9 circles is nothing compared to the prolonged suffering of the mother faced with the prospect of taking a toddler to the shoe store or on an airplane, tolerating summer break and dance recitals, or teaching a teen about driving or sex. The only thing worse, she implies in her introduction, is actually taking the time to read the poem. Gordon's jeers at Dante are fairly typical of bloggers' attitudes toward the poem whose systems they hijack. The austerity and monumentality of the original poem seem to lend the bloggers moralizing the severe critical legitimacy inherent to Dante's masterwork, while at the same time providing the bloggers the cultural cachet that accompanies flippant appropriations of canonical forms. So we've seen how Dante's text serves an iconic function in internet culture. It becomes a sort of shorthand for a vindictive justice that is exacted with great detail and precision against unsuspecting individuals and groups. But we're left with the question, why? Why are Dante and his Inferno particularly well suited to this kind of appropriation? For all of Dante's attempts to resist his own authorial death, and I use that term a la Barthes, the author of the comedy also repeatedly invites, or perhaps better insists, that his reader bolster her own interpretive faculties. Coupled with the moral sense of Dante's Polysemous allegory, that the lessons of the comedy's fiction are meant to determine our behavior in the here and now, and the insistence that the Inferno is as much a reflection of our world as it is of the world to come, the interpretive mechanisms of the poem, its hermeneutic structures, rely on the reader meeting the author halfway, completing the equation that the poet has set forth. By relinquishing half of the control, the poet means to encourage us to bring about our own conversions. He expects us to do the interpretive work ourselves. Those same structures, though, instead open the door to the myriad interpretations that swing wildly away from their original intent. Dante anticipated that some readers would misread and misunderstand. He did not anticipate a Cliff's Notes edition of his Inferno. So many commentators who write on the resonance of Dante's works in contemporary culture, and especially popular culture, focus their studies on the question of accessibility of the original poem. This is especially true of Dante's appropriation in video games, such as the two you see here. So these scholars claim that the contemporary references, like the video games, do one of two things. Either they raise awareness of the original poem and thus drive readers back to the study of it, performing what Millicent Marcus calls, in the context of film adaptation, a didactic service. Or on the other hand, they develop a kind of false consciousness around the poem that devalues the original and diminishes its study. So I want to suggest instead that the reductive references like the ones that I've demonstrated here and the countless others like them neither contribute to nor diminish the accessibility of the original poem. In fact, they have little to do with the poem themselves, relating to it in name only. So this serves to position Dante's Inferno as a strangely empty signifier in American popular culture, a hollow shell of a reference into which producers can pour their own content. It's little more than a map and a name. Dante's Inferno, to the Cliff's Notes Wikipedia reader like Meredith Gordon, signifies an onerous chore of a text, one not worthy of the limited time of the frenzied mother, for whom raising children is its own special hell. And yet, at the same time, the Inferno holds for Gordon the aura of the classical work of literature, its high concept lending her blog the cutting satirical edge that she may manipulate to her own purposes. In the hands of readers like Gordon, the poet becomes a forerunner of their critique, supplanting Minos as judge, casting sinners down to their rightful punishments. References such as these do not so much kill the author as reify him. Far from removing the poet's identity from the interpretation of the poem, Dante's person itself becomes shorthand for the same set of moralizing standards that his topography is seen to represent. Dante's name is immediately identified with a severe and authoritative moral vision, and this is maybe one place that Dennis's and my papers come together. Far from being a self-reflective poet pilgrim in search of his own salvation, Dante's identity is reduced to that of the visionary architect of the great infernal prison. In these references, Dante is relegated to the role of cultural troll, passive-aggressively pointing fingers at the behavior of his contemporaries and damning them to suffer their just deserts. You'll get yours, this Dante appears to be spewing as he blasts his enemies, not from behind a keyboard, but from behind the protection of his patron's generosity. These adaptations do not work to remove the poet from their hermeneutic structures. Quite the contrary, they lean on the authority of the poet to justify their own reproaches. So to my mind, and I'm coming to my conclusion now, to my mind, the central question here is what renders the Inferno so spreadable, to return to that word from contemporary media theory that I mentioned earlier. So speaking broadly, spreadable media are media that lend themselves to easy diffusion, particularly because they value active, unstructured, and unexpected participation and collaboration between diverse users and across diverse platforms. Now, at first blush, this description does not sound like it applies to Dante's Commedia, at least the way that he planned it. As the mastermind behind the universe of this text, Dante appears to have desired his poem to have one narrow, concrete, discoverable message communicated through a single channel to a particular reader who would read and uncover the unified message of the text. Indeed, if we're to attribute the Epistle to Can Grande to Dante, we see exacting measures on the poet's part to exert control over the meanings that could be received through a correct reading of the text, with nothing less at stake than the very salvation of our souls. Pace Dante and his fourfold allegorical mode of reading. This is not what the afterlife of the comedy bears out. Instead, the comedy appears to invite just the kind of active, unexpected, and easy to share engagements that we would expect of spreadable media, as the long history of its reception attests. This is especially true, I'd argue, of the last century, maybe even the last 50 years of its reception, as Dante's work becomes fodder for the mill of new media forms. Built into the poem's structure itself are hermeneutic demands that invite the reader's engagement. The poem demands that the reader interpret not only its allegory, but also its figurality, and to then apply those interpretations to his or her own life. These hermeneutic demands are, I argue, the same mechanisms that enable this open-ended and seemingly endless string of adaptations, translations, appropriations, and remixes of the original work. The poem calls its reader to an active engagement, and as she struggles to understand how the figures Dante selects from Tuscan history might stand in as metonymies for particular sins. But reading does not end there. In order to accomplish the soul-saving function that the poem prescribes, the reader must also reflect on the corresponding habits of thought and mind that characterize such a sin in her own contemporary age. That sort of reflection fosters precisely this unstructured and collaborative participation that's characteristic of spreadable media, and it results in the massive, open-ended, and readily shareable readings of Dante's works that we see in the 21st century and that we've striven to document on the Dante Today website. I'm going to stop there. Thank you so much.
Okay, this was great. It was illuminating for me. I have been myself writing about Dante, and Beth, with the last part of your talk, you were really, really illuminating. Thank you. Thank you very much. We had also the compliment from Christopher Kleinhans, who is a Dantista Italianista. So it's a great event. Thank you. I would like to start with Dennis. Now, Dennis, what I see and in this character, in this woman, Trollope, it's a big influence on how Dante was seen at the end of the 18th century and beginning of the 19th century, right? The representative of evil and sort of Dante was hell. We have Gothic novels like Beckford Vathek that actually mention just Dante just as the person that represents hell, or even Melmoth the Wanderer by Charles Maturin actually rewrites some parts of the Francesca and the Ugolino episode in it. So I don't know, but what is interesting though, what really interests me is the fact that this is a woman. Yeah. So, right. So do you see anything in there?
I think that's a really good point and observation, and one could explore that more deeply, including not just Frances Trollope, but Frances Wright. These are two women, and I would love to know their conversations about the curriculum for the school. You know, I would like to know a lot more about that. These are two women who are very high-powered, and Frances Wright was going around giving talks, as I said, about abolitionism and women's rights, and she was mercilessly caricatured in the press, as you can imagine. There are pictures of her with her head represented as a duck. So here's a woman walking around just quacking, you know, they were trying to say in the northern press, but of the US, but undeterred, she just kept on going, and Frances Trollope too. So these are two women who are empowered by their understanding of, they take from classical literature, and I'm putting Dante in that category, a kind of, from the classical education, a kind of power that they want to share. It's much easier to do that in this new country, this brand new country, that is built supposedly on freedom. I mean, we all know now in this season of our country's history, January 6th, George Floyd, all these things we've been talking about, it's a complicated history. And we need to keep talking about that and thinking about that. But they come naively, one might say, to the New World to spread the, not gospel, but to spread, talk about spreadability, to spread the learning of classical wisdom, including freedom. For them, it's all about freedom. And these are women who want to be free. So yeah, I mean, Frances Trollope identifies with enslaved people because she herself wants to be freer. I don't know much about Mr. Trollope, but she happily left him behind, or he happily was, he, maybe it was a mutual happiness, you know, you go over there and I'll see you in about 6 months. But you know, she was liberated from those kinds of commitments, and here she came, and Dante is part of what animates her. And Frances Wright too. I mean, in a bigger study, I would think more seriously about her as well.
Okay. So, and another question now, I'm for Beth, and so you mentioned that Dante and an empty signifier, right? So so basically Dante is something that is useful for in many fields. But do you see in the United States something different from what is going on in other places? Do you see a continuation, like you were mentioning a little bit, a continuation from Mrs. Trollope, right, from her take on Dante? Can you expand a little bit on this?
Sure. I mean, I think Americans are particularly fascinated with it seems like there's a particular fascination among Americans with the punishment aspect, right? Like that seems to be the thing that Americans relish the most about Dante. And this is like I mentioned in the talk, this is really derives, I think, directly from the kind of things that Dennis is seeing in his research, the kind of fun house Dante, the Dante that is one that you can sort of use as carnivalesque opportunity to explore the haunted house, right? To explore the horrors of hell, but in that Bakhtinian way that has the safety valve on it.
Yes.
You can just retreat from it back into the safety of your home. You know, I think that seems to be, at least from what we've gathered in the archive, that seems to be a particularly American phenomenon. And specifically North American, specifically, you know, talking about the United States. It's not exclusive to the U.S. And one of the other projects that I'm running, you know, continuing to think about this theme of the circles of hell, is I've been using Twitter. I've been using automated searches in Twitter to see how people use the language of the circle of hell or the girone infernale to ascribe their compatriots, their fellow Twitter users, to particular circles, or to say, you know, there's a circle of hell reserved for people who do X, or there's a girone infernale for people who do Y. And in that case, you see it really. I mean, the numbers of English language users that use that expression are absolutely astounding. I mean, I ran an automated search just in the background of my system for over the course of 6 months. And in 6 months, I had over 80,000 tweets, individual tweets, that use the reference circle of hell or circles of hell to make some kind of comment on Twitter. That far outscaled what we saw or what I saw of uses of girone infernale. However, we do see references to Dante really coming from and to that specific idea of justice coming from all over the world. And in particular, you know, when you start looking at some of the more in-depth engagements, the engagements that use Dante to reflect on something like global catastrophe, that's something that you see everywhere. I mean, we see, for example, in lots of news reporting on catastrophic fires, for example. And I've seen, comments from Latin America, from the US, from elsewhere. People would say it looked like Dante's Inferno in there. And so there are any number of ways that it gets used globally. Mostly, my research has been focused exclusively on what Americans do with it. And so I haven't seen that same phenomenon elsewhere, but I also don't speak all languages. So I don't know how Circle of Hell translates into Korean, for example.
We had a related question from the audience. Or sorry, Dennis, did you want to say something?
Dennis.
I'll just add quickly to that. Yeah, Americans are obsessed with justice and contrapasso and all of that. But I think there's a flip side to that, that the American response, and this is going back to 1828 again, the American response is also consistently interested in the idea of the children of Israel getting freed from slavery. So the children of Israel, as a figure or as an emblem or as a model for a kind of spiritual development and growth and freedom. And that's a lot of what people who study Dante think are have to think about when they think about the text, including that simile that I cited where he's just escaped by the skin of his teeth. He's almost dead. He's like a shipwrecked sailor, but he made it to the shore and he's got a new chance. He's going to start over again. So there's a notion of being free from hell. And I think that, what I find in African-American responses, that is part of what they're very in tune with. Free at last, thank God Almighty, I'm free at last. I'm not there anymore. And so it is about justice and, all of that, but, and I agree completely, but there's this other side. And, there was a question, the very first question that came in was about where's purgatory, where's paradise?
That was the question I was going to read, exactly. So
okay.
Like for both of you, can you think of examples where people do reference purgatory or paradise? Because I thought that was a really interesting question.
You go first, Beth, because I don't have any.
I have loads. The Dante Today archive is full of them. But it actually ties directly in with what Dennis was just saying about the importance of freedom, and in particular, the ways of thinking about spirituality, reflecting on spirituality and spiritual conversion. We have a whole subset. In fact, one of my research assistants, I think, is still here, and she has just been posting a whole string of pieces that are using Dante to reflect on spirituality, and especially in the key, and what we're seeing with this tendency towards the popular, it's especially in the key of self-help. So lots of books, lots of self-help books, or kind of pop psychology or pop spirituality books will use not the Inferno necessarily, but sort of the whole text to think about to sort of put the reader or put the author in the place of the pilgrim and think about how the journey is this spiritual liberation from sin, etc. I don't know, Dennis, what do you see in your side of
well said. African-American readers in that reception are very interested in spiritual development and growth and the potential. It's sort of an optimistic way to think about bad things. This is all bad, but one day we'll get to the promised land and then it won't be so bad. So it's a kind of hopeful reading. And there are some African-American responses that touch on purgatory and paradise. It's much, 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 much quantitatively less than Inferno. And let's just be fair, we have lots of students here too. Most of us, when we read Dante, read the Inferno, and then that's it. And so if you've read the Inferno, good for you. I would say read Purgatory. You won't believe it, how good it is and how topical it is, how connected it is with the world of the present. And then Paradise is another challenge, but I would say read that too. Take them in bits and you get to Paradise and it opens up all kinds of things as well. And there's a lot in there about justice, among other things.
If I can, I want to make a plug while Dennis is making a plug for reading Purgatory. I would make a plug for also listening to there's a series of YouTube conversations right now called the Canto per Canto series that the Dante Society of America is running, where they've invited members of the Dante Society, both scholars and and teachers and students and members of the general public to contribute YouTube conversations where they sit down with another person and just talk through a canto at a time. And the ones on Purgatory seem to feel particularly resonant. Like there was one in particular on Purgatory 2 that I'm thinking about that was thinking a lot about like how we think about Dante in light of the pandemic, and why Purgatory 2 and the failed embrace would feel particularly resonant in this moment. So I want to recommend that you look up the Canto per Canto series on YouTube and check some of those out.
I see a question in here. Let me just say, I'm going to save the chat, and if you've written me a direct question, I'll respond to you because I can't keep track. I mean, there's so many things coming in. It's amazing. But someone is saying, Matthew Baymiller is saying, America is a country with a death penalty. I do think that one of the most common justifications of the death penalty is that the worst deserve the worst punishment. I can't respond to that in terms of Dante off the cuff, but I'm going to think about it, and I will. What amazes me about Dante, and here I would challenge Beth a little bit. Beth said Dante has a controlled vision, and wants to control one way of thinking about his poem. So I wrote it down as this question: did Dante really think of one controlled meaning of his poem? I know that there are readers of Dante who say that he did. I think his reading of Dante, I think his own reading of his own poem is more complicated. So some of you know about this. There are sodomites who are punished for being sodomites in Canto 15 of the Inferno. And maybe you haven't read this far and you don't know this yet. There are poets up at the top of Mount Purgatory. They are the next people the next souls in line to become saints in heaven. And they are gay poets. Okay. So Dante has homosexual erotic poets who are about to become saints in the same poem where he's got sodomites. And among the sodomites, let me just say in parentheses, is his teacher whom he adores, and are 3 Florentine politicians of whom he says, I would have jumped down there and hugged them, except I would get burnt up, and I didn't want to get burnt up. So, you know, Dante himself on that question, same-sex love, sodomy, seems to express different responses. So I think if there's one controlled meaning to his poem, it's complicated, including the idea, and this is back to death penalty, the idea of universal salvation, which Dante talks about. Dante the poet talks about up in Paradise. It's Canto 19. In the Sphere of Justice, he challenges, the writer challenges the notion that even if you're a good person, but you live over in India and you've never heard of anybody talk about Jesus Christ, you're not baptized in a Christian, you're going to go to hell. He challenges that. And so back to death penalty, I think Dante might say, you know, I want to think about the death penalty. He might challenge it, but I don't want to be ridiculous in my comment. So Matthew, I'll respond to you off list.
Dennis, I take your provocation, and I like your provocation, and I appreciate it. I have gone back and forth about what kind of Dante I think I want to believe in, and what I've come down on in my own thinking about this question is, I think the poem is open to so many interpretive possibilities that we can really, you know, if you want to read Inferno 15 as a condemnation of sodomy or of homosexuality, you can absolutely do so. You can, and it has been, you know, as you well know, it has been historically put to that use many times over. If you want to read it in light of, you know, this more, let's call it a more progressive reading, you can do that as well, because it leaves itself open to those possibilities. I think to me at least, that's a principle of the poem, but not necessarily something that we can assume of the poet. So I would separate the two. I think the poem happens to do those things. I am cautious about how much the poet himself would have wanted us to do those things. I think the poet wants us to save our souls and go to paradise.
On that note, I think we are out of time. Thank you so much for such an engaging conversation. So thank you to both of our speakers, Beth Coggeshall and Dennis Looney. Thank you to Cosetta for moderating. And thank you so much for all of you coming here. It's been absolutely wonderful.
Great, really. Thank you, Beth, and thank you, Dennis. Really, I
Thank
hope
you.
to meet you again very soon. Okay, bye.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
While people are signing out, I just wanted to thank Mel.